This is the title of my paper. I thank you all for having the invitation that you addressed to me. Here is the itinerary that I'm going to try to respect. So I will stick to the problem of divergence as a research motif, thus being faithful to your defeat. And I will discuss mainly a problem which is connected to the present state of the art regarding the research in Brazil, which I will call the common view. And this perspective, or this stance, sustains mainly that Jesuit Brazilian Aristotelianism echoes mostly two Portuguese philosophical sources during its entire history: the authority of Pedro de Fonseca and the Coimbra Jesuit course. And if having the opportunity to discuss this common view, I will also try to suggest a methodological shift from this common view, looking ahead to the future research. But I gladly see it that it is not, my suggestions of future research will not be so different from those already stated by Virginia. So, of course, if I want to discuss this subject, two caveats are needed, and the first one regards the historical period of our research. Brazil has a specific situation. It is connected with the expulsion of the Society of Jesus from Portugal. So this is a period of time which is bigger than the one proposed by the organizers of this interesting forum. So let me start by saying that the theme of divergence is crucial, not only when we regard or we face the situation of South America and Brazil in particular, but also when we face the situation of Portugal, so the inner situation. A few facts that I would like to recall may emphasize this situation of kind of divergence among the Portuguese, and of course I will stick to the Society of Jesus. First one, the fact of Fonseca and his relations with the Spanish Pedro Gomes or Luis de Molina, and the discussions involved between these three Jesuits as regards the structure of the Coimbra Jesuit course. Another fact is, for instance, the text of Bento Pereira, a student in the Évora University, Castata Fe, Opinione Etrusco Magistri Mei Conimbricensis et Evorensis, which is almost like a list of difficult situations or difficult issues, of difficult theses taught in universities by the professors of this young student, Bento Pereira, both in the university, in the College of Coimbra and the University of Évora. Another example, it will be the situation of Francisco Monteiro, divergences from Francisco Soares Lusitano in connection with physical topics, just like Francisco de Amaral in connection with an enormous course written by Baltasar Teles. Not only the Spaniards were object of some kind of censorship from their Portuguese companions, but we also know that, for instance, a Brazilian paper, a Logica Magna et Parvua from Antonio de Andrade, was not approved in 1701. So no doubt that the fate of Latin American second scholasticism, one was of divergence, at least taking expression its mere or loose geographical sense. Geographically speaking, of course, it is obvious that scholasticism in the lands of the Holy Cross, as the Brazilian territory was immediately called by scholastic literature, took a divergent path from Portugal. But the question remains, is this true philosophically or ideologically speaking? And this is my core, the core of my paper. I may refer only two examples. The first one by a Brazilian scholar, Lúcio Álvaro Marques, which in The Logic of Necessity, his book, echoes a perspective spread among contemporary Brazilian scholars coming from several disciplines that sides by a negative answer to the questions mentioned by me in this paper. And another example coming from history is from historian José Murilo de Carvalho, fostered the idea that contrary to the culture and political plurality typical of the Spanish America, Brazilian fragmentation was avoided due to a most unitarian Portuguese basis. And of course, that basis would be the University of Coimbra. But two different and interesting cases could be mentioned at the outset that could exemplify the divergence of the situation of the Jesuits in Brazil. And of course, they are common to the regions, to the geographical regions and countries that you have already spoken. Virginia also spoke about it. But it's curious, the two examples that I want to give. The first one comes from a film of a Portuguese director, Manuel de Oliveira, in his film from 2000, Word and Utopia. He put the young Jesuit Antonio Vieira, he pictures it learning how to say the sixth commandment in Tupi language. And this portrays how far away could go the liberty of accommodation, replacing European use of learning Greek with a pragmatical bet on knowing local languages, as something that was formalized by the provincial Luis de Gra. A second argument, or better still, a second example of this divergence, a later one, of course, would be the testimony of Newton's in his Principia Mathematica, alluding to the Jesuit Valentin Stansel on March 5th, 1668. In his Principia Mathematica, Newton unwittingly testifies to curious moves by the Jesuit Valentin Stansel in Brazil. And even Newton, in his Principia Mathematica, could not cope exactly with the divergence that was at stake in the observations made by Stansel in Brazil, because he inscribed them in the three kinds of moves that were not clearly divergent. In order to contextualize the observations made by the Czech Jesuit in Bahia, Newton calls in what was being said in Portugal about the 45 degrees of the bulk of the tail of the comet. He quotes the description made by Aristotle in Meteorology about the comet's light, and finally, he remarks the specificity of regional or local observation. And only in this last remark was Newton touching the divergence issue that we are going to address, that I'm going to address you now. Because indeed, Stansel's contributions were specific to Brazil, and we only have to think about some of his books written whose subject was coming directly from the observations made in Brazil territory. So I go now to my third point. I'll be very brief and I'll try to skip to the time that was given to me. From Coimbra and Évora to Bahia and Maranhão. So these several rupture situations being remembered, I may now return to the issue of continuity in connection with the common view that I would like to address directly. Two former Coimbra students, Manuel de Nóbrega and José de Anchieta, would somehow confirm the importance of that city, Coimbra, and its Jesuit college. Nóbrega arrived Bahia on March 1549 and Anchieta in July 1553, headed by Luis de Gra, who, by the way, after his graduation in civil canon law at the University of Coimbra, had been the fourth rector of the Coimbra College of Jesus. So these initial years would be, of course, laboratory or experimental in those times, so to speak, but we see clearly that, at least geographically speaking, I mean, in a way that geography and intellect or culture themes are connected or may be connected, has some interesting remarks to and arguments that favor the common view. But let us stick to philosophy, because the other arguments or the other examples that I gave you, the ones by Stansel and by the learning of the Tupi language, was, of course, something that is not connected with philosophy. So let me stick to philosophy and take into consideration epochs, goals, and regions. Before 1555 and the last year of the 16th century, Coimbra was still engaged in trying to define a Jesuit phylum doctrinae. And this program was written not only by the Ratio Studiorum, of course, that coincides almost with the complexion of the Coimbra Jesuit course, but with the course itself, because the course itself was written and published with a clear program, that the program of giving to the whole of the society a kind of ideal, or what should be the Jesuit philosophy as it should in all the situations, all the colleges, in all the regions, geographical regions, the Jesuits were have to teach. So if we stick to these programs and this situation, this Portuguese situation, we can see already that the first, and we may ask the question, that the first in connection with the first professor who arrived to Brazil and ask what kind of philosophy could Gonçalo Leite, because it is of Gonçalo Leite I'm talking now, could he teach? Because he was the first lecturer, the first Jesuit ever to lecture philosophy in Brazil. When he taught the arts, what manuscripts or books or found sources, philosophical sources, were available to Gonçalo Leite. Surely he would have at his disposal some manuscripts previous to 1570s that could testify to the level and content of the studies in those early years. For instance, dated 1559, the much disputed manuscript 2399 of the General Library of the University of Coimbra conveys the study of the De Anima, followed by a brief examination of some chapters of the Metaphysica. Another manuscript from 1563 by the later Brazilian provincial Inácio de Tolosa covers the 8 books of the Physica. So besides the curious fact of including a very short section written in Portuguese language about the Southern Cross constellation, another manuscript dated Christmas 1570 discovered the entire Physica and also deals with the Caelo, Ethica, and the Sphera. Of course, I do not and I cannot mean that Leite did use any or one of those manuscripts, but it is obvious that previous to the Coimbra Jesuit course, there were several possibilities for covering or going behind this course, which, of course, the common view states it would be the major source for Brazilian philosophy. Just, for example, just sticking to Friedrich Stegmüller's catalog, other exported candidate manuscripts to Brazil could be quoted here and now. For example, the Scholia by Pedro Martins, the Isagoge by Molina, the Universum Logica Aristotelis by Melchior Lobato, or the Physica, the De Generatione, De Anima, and the Ethica by Pedro Luiz. It is highly probable that Tolosa or Leite use their own or borrowed Portuguese manuscripts to their lectures. Such was the usual practice among the Jesuits, who in Portugal were frequently sent from one college to another, forever to Coimbra and vice versa, according to the sound testimony of Pedro da Fonseca. The custom went behind those two cities because we knew of an international expression of this custom. Historian of the Society, João Pedro Pereira Gomes, for instance, confirms this practice in Évora. And I would like also to insist on this precise Jesuit university as a real player in all these didactic complex relations. Not only Évora witnessed to Molina's theological new key, because his De Justitia Juris stems from his lectures given there, but it is imperative to claim the relevance of its university as regards the history of overseas. Remember that Molina's approach to the Prima Secundae on invincible ignorance explicitly mentions the case of the Brazilian Indians, or Gaspar Gonçalves, a member of the committee responsible for the redaction of the Ratio Studiorum, also taught at Évora. Note also that on 1639, coming from Évora precisely, Pedro de Moura was nominated visitor of Brazil, and that only on June 1st, 1709, the Chancellor of the University of Évora, Luís Fragoso, received the task from the General Michael Tamburini and the order to deliver the chancellery responsibility to the Bahia College. And of course, we could name very other names that are connected with the situation of Brazil, but coming from the University of Évora. And this, of course, questions immediately the common view. But I have been talking about manuscripts, so we could ask about what could be the situation in relation to printed books. In December 21st, 1555, Father Grant asks the General for textbooks for usage in the Bahia College. A similar request made by John Vicente was that took the same direction, because he asks for English, Latin, and Spanish books. And you can see Portugal seems to be ignored. And this is quite understandable, because Tolosa was a Spaniard and Yates was an English Jesuit. So previous to the publication of the Coimbra Jesuit course, there were no standardized published texts, and only that publication could become a landmark for those interpreters wishing to adopt the common view. Manuel de Lima, professor of Évora Portuguese University, so could have sailed with some exemplars of the whole of the course. And this, of course, could mean that those sustaining the common view could have a sound argument to insist upon the veracity of their argument, of their thesis. But this thesis, the common view, has some issues, because the authority and spread of the Coimbra Jesuit course could hardly be a reality, even in Portugal, not to mention in the rest of Europe. From its very first edition, the Coimbra Jesuit course was being criticized everywhere, and its size was a real impediment for using it in lecture halls. It is surprising that the catalog of the Casa da Vigia library in Brazil does not register a sole example of the Coimbra Jesuit course. Still, Father Lima could not throw away his personal experience in philosophy, and another hypothesis could be that Lima, just like Tolosa, took with him copies of his own lessons on Aristotle. This was, in fact, sound probability. But if we stick to the publication of the course, what we can immediately see is that one must count a history that is previous to this publication and another completely different after the publication of the course. And we can go even further and see that, for instance, in the 17th century marks a totally different period in the history of philosophy in Brazil. In 1680, the Bahia College acknowledged that his level in arts had been formally recognized, and 7 years later begins a higher level of studies in Olinda, in Pernambuco. So signs of maturity surely demand the existence of a suitable and consistent library. Between 1686 and 1757, the Society of Jesus reached its peak in Brazil, and in those years could have appeared a divide between a second and a third periods in the history of philosophy in Brazil. And this is completely ignored by historians in Brazil. And the final period would eventually touch the last years of the 18th century, witnessing to the entrance of the eclectic paradigm among the Jesuits contemporary to the publication of the Conclusiones Metaphysica by Francisco de Farias in Brazil. Nevertheless, there are sound arguments that go in the direction of the common view. For instance, published materials originated in Maranhão and Pará are known to us, and they dating from 17th century and 18th century, and they are mostly theses, and all extant now in the public library of Évora. They belong to a literary genre, very specific one, conclusiones, asserciones. The name differs, but its specificity and its frame is usually the same. What happened in Brazil, as testified by this series of theses that belong to Maranhão and Pará, is exactly the same situation, coincides exactly the same situation in Portugal. For instance, from Évora, 31 conclusions related to all kinds of Aristotelian subject matters by Gaspar Vaz, even preceded by António de Vasconcelos' Conclusões Filosóficas Liberais Naturales. So this is a sound argument in favor of the common view. And two of these Jesuits that were linked to this thesis published or belonging to the situation of Brazil are of the utmost interest, one by Rodrigo Homem and the others by Bento da Fonseca. With a curious difference, because Bento da Fonseca, differently from Rodrigo Homem, was not educated in Portugal. So the situation is interesting because Rodrigo Homem was educated in Portugal. He lectured philosophy at Maranhão and theology at Pará. But differently, Bento da Fonseca was a genuine and entirely Jesuit Brazilian scholar. And he too, during the same period, the 20s, had the chance to direct 20 of the theses in the absence of Homem. So arguably, some of these theses by Homem allows to face the common view. But to the sake of my argument, because I would like to challenge this view, I choose three relevant names, not from Coimbra, but from Évora. They are Manuel Álvares, José Álvares, and Francisco Ferreira. And the reason why I choose those three names is evident per se, because in the years during which the three of them taught in Portugal coincide exactly with those of Homem in Brazil, and my choice for texts originated in Évora needs not to be confirmed, because I would like to stress the importance of the University of Évora in the relation with Brazil. So the course Manuel Álvares lecture between 1719 and 21 is divided in three parts: universal, science, and topics. But these, of course, seem more or less coincide with the texts belonging to Rodrigo Homem in Maranhão. Besides the mentioned Curso Filosófico, Álvares published a similar thesis in 1723. And you see in this frame some issues that are similar with those that were taught in Évora. So it seems that the sea, the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, had no interference in this common literature. A common soil could explain the tellai, which is the thesis by Rodrigo Homem, and also his section Labor 2, that were addressed the issue or the topic of metaphysics of possibility, which is, of course, the same situation, the exact same discussion we have here in Portugal, and namely in Évora. In contrast, however, not long before, António Simões was teaching Aristotle on the soul using the ancient method of addressing the books in the frame of the old literature and the old genre. So it would be interesting, because we see that if the situation in Brazil coincides with the situation of some theses that were taught in Évora, at the exact same moment, there was other professors that still were attached to the old methods of commenting Aristotle. So a commentary such as Simões differed in style from Homem's Labor 2. Is this a sign of discontinuity or diversion, this time of Portugal in relation to Brazil, or merely an indication that teachers had some kind of liberty to deal with the prescribed subject matters, or were simply conditioned by some other type of circumstances? So of course, another argument is that another thesis by Homem, Acutioris Luminis Aquilae, seems to coincide to reinforce this common situation between Portugal and Brazil, at least didactically speaking. 5 of the points of the text by Homem testify to the maintenance of the concern towards substance, modality, subsistence, relations between philosophy and theology, and so on. And so another interesting parallelism is the fact that logical texts from Maranhão do not diverge from Sebastião do Couto's and Pedro da Fonseca's commentary. And it is possible to make some parallelisms, some confrontations. The 3 major topics addressed by Homem coincide with the Institutiones Dialéticas by Fonseca, chapter 1.1 and 1.3. And another text by Homem, the Philum 1, abridges the 6 questions by Couto, meaning the definition of dialectics, its division, and its object. Another parallel situation, the film 2 by Omen, deals with universals, and this subject does not pertain to an introduction to dialectics, but it is a matter of the utmost importance, mainly in chapters 2 to 8 of the second book of Fonseca's. So, in a nutshell, this seems to confirm the common view that, in fact, in Brazil, the situation was the same. They was teaching the same subject matters along with the same ideas. Film 3 by Omen is a successful digest of Fonseca's and of Couto's teaching. The usual subjects are discussions. We have a discussion there. The definition of a sign, for instance, is almost a repetition of Couto's widespread thought, and the core of the doctrine about the dual relation of any sign and their main divisions is repeated. So, what can we say that may at least give some opportunities to discuss this common view? If we stick to a closer inspection, we see a different picture. Because Couto's larger frame regarding possible divisions of dialectics is omitted in Omen's text, and the divisions of the latter text into actual and attitudinal sciences are not discussed in Couto's Proemion. So the Brazilian text envisage the theoretical and practical dialectical from a different angle. And the same happens with the discussion on the material object, the formal object, and the object of attribution of logic. If we now go to film 2, we see this situation, whereas Couto, while commenting the isagoge and the categories, of course, so Couto is the author of the logic of the Coimbra commentary, if he took the occasion to discuss universals, summing up the break Aquinas versus Scott, what was the situation in Brazil? Omen's text follows particularities, very interesting particularities. For example, an adherence to nominalism, a rejection of realism, a rejection of what's so-called integralism, the doctrine of a formal and objective distinction in metaphysical grades, and an alleged divergence from the common doctrine concerning the abstraction of the universals that put the stress upon the rejection of any sensible input in the process of abstraction. So, Couto in Portugal had also discussed issues neglected in Brazil. And this is a very good argument that may confirm that we cannot only see coincidence, we can also see divergences. We can speak best, and I try to be very brief now. So I would say in the end that the devil is in the details, and that allows me to propose at least a subtle methodological shift in research in relation to Brazil, to the history, or to a narrative or a future narrative of the history of the second scholastic in Brazil. Because details are very important, not only because subtleties were something that were crucial to this kind of philosophy and thinking, but also because we are addressing a kind of Baroque philosophy. But it is also because, and at least it is because it was in details that professors could be diverge and make their own specificity, even if they have to follow a ratio studiorum, the same ratio studiorum, and attached to the same indications regarding the authorities that should be, of course, as everybody knows, Aristotle in philosophy and Aquinas in theology. As might be confirmed by Portuguese texts of manuscripts by Bento Viegas, and the text also in Brazil by Rodrigo Homem and Bento Fonseca, the triple division used in the changing of the century, logic, physics, and metaphysics, is there present. But this goes far beyond the Portuguese situation or the Society of Jesus, because we have, and everybody, this is disseminated everywhere, but for instance, a Scottish manuscript by José de Conceição shares the same pattern. So, in the 18th century, we, because as I have already mentioned, I propose that this situation, these particularities belonging to Brazil, must only not lead us to be attentive to details that are related to professors, but with difference in relation to regions and epochs. And in the 18th century, the traditional Aristotelian divisions of the disciplines were substituted by the following: the first year, the second year, and the third year. And as you can see in this, what is appearing in your computers. And of course, this represents a blow up that makes impossible to still think about the original Coimbra Jesuit course. And it is no matter, it would be impossible already to follow it, and because it was completely different and completely divergent from this the first program and the actual program followed in the 18th century. For instance, you have here a manuscript by Manuel Duarte that divides in philosophy in the following parts: psychology, physiology, metaphysics, and the remaining issues of natural philosophy. And of course, this not coincides with the Coimbra Jesuit course. Or another manuscript has a quaternary, but other examples could be indicated. And I give here the names of the authors and the titles of their manuscripts as well. I'm arriving to the end. Divided into Philosophia Rationalis, Naturalis, and Transnaturalis. This is the triadic feature of the text by Omen in Brazil. This coincides with some particular fields of research identified by the first of the two main strands defined for this workshop. And of course, the lion's share of dialectics is evident in both Portuguese Atlantic shores, but one must not ignore that after Couto's contribution, logic or dialectics received the attention of Gregorio Barreto. And Gregorio Barreto contributions is a known effort to put an halt to individual supplements that were being favored everywhere in Portugal and of course in Brazil. And another candidates that must be looked upon if one wants to closely check the details and closely check the relations between what was being done in Portugal and what was being done in Brazil, one has also to attend to courses such as those by Baltasar do Amaral, Baltasar Teles, Francisco Soares Lusitanos, António Cordeiro, and at least Agostinho Lourenço. So, in the end, I believe that the following must change. A new methodology can be implemented. And I am glad to acknowledge that these suggestions that I'm not going to read them because you can read them better than I do, but I am glad to acknowledge that all these indications, a change of methodology, are not very far away from the proposal that Virginia suggested already for her particular field. So this what I can say to you in a brief manner to indicate to you that I see the situation in Brazil in a different from a different perspective, and that perspective should point to details, and those details should be envisaged from a geographical, a historical, and an individual point of view. Thank you very much.